Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Maria Cabana. I am Associate Director in Marketing at Altasciences. Today, we will be discussing cannabis and clinical trials. What you can expect in our discussion today is a general overview of clinical trial methods, study design, and regulatory considerations. We have two very special guests with us today. Dr. Beatrice Setnik, Chief Scientific Officer at Altasciences, and Ingrid Holmes, Vice President of Global Clinical Operations at Altasciences. Together, they bring many years of experience in clinical trials, clinical drug development, regulatory filing, and are both experts in the field of cannabis and clinical trials. Thank you, Beatrice and Ingrid. So to begin, for our first question, Ingrid, would you be able to walk us through the different pathways to market cannabis?
Sure. I think if we go back, traditionally, there was no real official legal way to market cannabis products. And just over the last few years, we've seen such a change in the market across North America. So of course, within Canada and many states in the US, there is a legal or legalized framework for recreational use. There are times when clinical trials and studies actually are performed in that market segment. Traditionally also there was a medicinal route of approval. So for certain patients who would benefit from using general herbal cannabis products, there was a way to get that product legally to patients as well. And lately, there's been a huge influx of research into using both derived cannabis products and cannabidiol into medicinal products. So for traditional drug products, and those would go through the normal route of clinical trials to obtain market authorization to get into the medical field.
And Beatrice, are there specific types of studies that are needed to evaluate the safety and efficacy of cannabis?
Yes, and it really depends on the type of pathway that you're selecting. So certainly when you're dealing with medicinal use, efficacy becomes an important question to understand if the product is helpful in the indication. We're always interested in safety. That's a very important component irrespective of what type of pathway you're developing, whether it be for medicinal or recreational use. It is important also to characterize the absorption, distribution, metabolism, excretion of these drugs, how they're absorbed and processed through the body. For patients, it's important to understand dosing and frequency to enable appropriate prescribing. The risk-benefit profile is generally needed. And when you're dealing with populations and variability in populations, it's important to understand if there are any contraindications. So if there are any potential drug interactions that should be noted, and as well as the safety in vulnerable patients. So usually these types of early drug interaction and safety studies are done in a phase 1 setting where you do small trials that can evaluate the metabolism and safety. And then you move on to larger studies in patients that will determine whether the drug is effective and safe in the target populations that are targeted mainly for medicinal use. So there are a variety of different studies that can be done to support the pathway that the product is intended for.
And my next question, Ingrid, what are the clinical pharmacology data requirements determined by the FDA, Health Canada, and ICH guidances?
So it really does depend on what the market that the client is intending to go for with their submission. If you're following a traditional drug and you are using this to prescribe to patients, you're going to have to follow a pretty traditional pathway for drug development. There is quite a lot of information known about cannabis already, so therefore there may be some exemptions for that sponsor. There may be discussions about what form of preclinical work may or may not be needed, what clinical trials would be needed, and also, as Beatrice was describing, what would be required for safety and efficacy. And because there's so much literature out there and there is a lot studied already, they may be able to avoid certain steps that you would traditionally need to go through. So it is really important that depending on the market and depending on the area you would like to submit to, in terms of government. So FDA, Health Canada, EMA, et cetera, you really need to consult with them in advance to understand what those requirements would be. And that's for the drug side. Of course, if you're looking at, a recreational market, or you're looking at something more for consumer products, that those would follow those guidances, and every state and country is developing their own guidelines and rules and regulations around those. So you really do need to know the area where you intend to market and sell the product, and also know, of course, the what's legal in those areas.
And Beatrice, when preparing your study design, what should you consider when evaluating cannabinoids?
Well, I think the first thing is always patient safety. So the type of population that you'll be enrolling, when you're doing some of the preliminary testing, looking at safety, tolerability, the pharmacokinetics, keeping in mind that products can have various different ratios of THC, cannabidiol, and different other active ingredients in these formulations, we want to have an understanding if it's well tolerated and safe. So oftentimes these will be smaller trials to initially not expose a large number of subjects, but to have a small group where you can understand how the product is being administered and if there are any safety concerns. And these are done typically in normal healthy volunteers. However, if you are introducing, depending on the route of administration, because these products can come in various types of forms, for example, inhalation, for vaping, they can be administered orally. You may also need to consider how you're administering the drug and what the population, if they're experienced. Somebody who's vaping or smoking something for the first time will likely have a lot of adverse effects because they're not used to inhalation. So in those cases, you may wish to select a population that's slightly more experienced with these types of routes of administration. So, and oftentimes when you're doing these types of clinical studies and you're administering products that emit vapor or smoke, you need to have well-controlled smoking chambers. So the study site will need to have very well ventilated, isolated chambers in which the drug can be safely administered to subjects, minimize exposure to other staff in the clinics, and have it safely contained in an environment that's controlled. So this is a very important consideration when you're administering products other than oral or through routes that don't contaminate air or are possibly to expose other individuals to it. They're also, so that's done a lot with the combustible and vaping. So the population and the environment and the appropriate clinic setup is very important to consider in those cases. We have also done a number of, many of the different edibles are coming out to market. People have different flavors for vapes, and there's all sorts of variety of how these products are packaged and marketed. A lot of the time, sometimes focus groups can be very helpful in determining, evaluating the preference of the product, the taste, if it's something that's palatable to the consumer or the end user. These can be conducted in focus group studies, and those are usually types of studies that are intended for products more for recreational use rather than medical use. When you're dealing with a botanical and you're targeting it as a medicinal, then you would be doing more of a formal drug development pathway. So you're considering now your regulatory requirements. You'd be looking at guidances. For example, the FDA has a guidance on the development of botanicals, and you'd be following a more traditional drug pathway in which you're going through phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 of your clinical development program. Phase 1 starting with very early phase, first in human, probably a normal healthy volunteer pharmacokinetic studies looking at the safety and pharmacokinetic profiles, and then escalating and moving along towards your target patient populations. First, you do a phase 2 trial in a smaller subset of patients to see if the drug is effective in that indication. And if you're starting to see signals that, yes, this product can help alleviate their target patient population and their symptoms of their pathology, then you move into the larger efficacy studies that then confirm that the product is in fact efficacious. One of the things, of course, to consider carefully when you're doing patient studies or you're looking at a product for medicinal use is to really dose range and understand the impact of increasing the doses on both the safety tolerability as well as the effectiveness, because different doses can be effective in different for different indications. Sometimes you may have to change the balance, the ratios of THC to cannabidiol or other active excipients in the products in the formulation. And so there's a lot of fine tuning of that and a lot of experimentation that can go in the earlier smaller patient studies that enables you to do that. And I think one of the key things that's lacking in some of the non-traditional medicinal use products are the dosing information, and that becomes very important to a clinician and the patient when they're trying to tailor their use to alleviate the symptoms of their condition. So that's something very important to study and to have that information on hand when a product gets released so that it can be used safely and effectively in that population. When you're following a more formal drug development pathway, you then need to also consider other aspects of safety when it comes to psychoactive compounds like THC. So things how this product may impact driving depending on the dosage, how it may affect the abuse potential or the control of the drug to the unintended user. So there are specific studies that look at abuse potential for recreational drug users. And one such example is the recently approved Epidiolex, which is just a cannabidiol formulation intended for different forms of epilepsy in both childhood and adults. And this is a product that initially came out with a Schedule 5 and then just recently was unscheduled because of the robust abuse potential work to evaluate that compound. It was determined that it didn't need to have a scheduling status, unlike THC, which is psychoactive. So again, it depends on the compound that you're working with and the degree to which it may cause psychoactive effects. But there's certainly measures of cognition that can be added to studies to evaluate those important safety parameters. We also mentioned the drug-drug interactions and studying the drug in different populations. When you have something that's federally legalized, for example, marijuana in Canada, the intended recipients can be various ages. It can be younger people, it can be elderly people, it could be people with pathologies and with other comorbidities who are on different medications. And understanding the safety of that drug in those populations is very important so that you don't have any drug interactions, you don't have any additive cognitive enhancing effects in terms of impairing effects if they're taking THC with a drug that may also cause some symptoms of whether it's dizziness or some other CNS effects that may contribute to a safety profile that may be inhibitory or impairing. So these are all very important considerations. So you need to understand what population you're targeting, mainly on the drug development path that you're taking. But safety is always the cornerstone, irrespective of what pathway you take. Knowing that your product is safe and well tolerated is the key fundamental basis to any drug approval pathway.
And Ingrid, navigating regulatory requirements can sometimes be challenging. So what does legal really mean?
Yeah, that's that's a great question, actually. I can speak specifically for Canada, but I know this has been an issue, across the states as well, where things are treated at a state level, let's say, instead of federally. In Canada, there was federal legislation that came down to all of the provinces a couple of years ago, and we call it legal in quotations. The intention of that legislation was not to turn marijuana and cannabis into something that is completely legal and you can do anything you want with it. It really was to decriminalize owning and consuming small quantities of marijuana. So, you're over 21 years old and you have a small quantity on this for recreational use. You should not go to jail because of it. You should not be arrested. You should not have a criminal record because of it. And that was the intention of that legislation. So what we saw shortly, pretty much as soon as the decriminalization was announced, what we saw pretty immediately was an influx of requests to run cannabis trials in Canada from sponsors around the world. And really quite interesting that the perception of a lot of those clients was that this is now legal in Canada, so you can just run those studies. You can just take any product into the country. You don't have to worry about the border anymore. You don't need any kind of import permits, anything like that. And you can just run the study, which is completely not the case at all. The regulations are different across North America, but there is one thing that would be sort of consistent at a very high level, is that even if it is decriminalized or considered legal to consume up to a certain amount or grow up to a certain amount, there is still a legalized framework that you need to operate within. It's never going to be legal for you to smoke a joint while you're driving down the road. It's never going to be legal for a CRO to run any kind of trial they feel they need to run in Canada, because even though it has been decriminalized, and even though as a product of that, cannabis has been, for the vast majority, removed from the Controlled Drug Substances Act, there is a whole new set of legislation within Canada that addresses cannabis specifically and how to manage it safely. So it's a great question, because there's a lot of I'd say misconceptions around what does legalization really mean, and it actually is just as complicated to run a clinical trial as it used to be in many cases. In some cases, it's a little easier, but we really have to become experts on those changes and what the regulations mean.
And what would a sponsor need prior to conducting a clinical trial from a regulatory standpoint?
Yeah, so again, I know we keep going back to understanding the location and the nature of the trial. That's all very important. That's sort of the first step that you need to address. There can also be a strategy on where to conduct the trial, let's say US versus Canada, or certain states within the US versus Canada, based on that regulatory strategy. So where will it actually be easier to conduct that trial based on the regulations in that geographic area? So that's the first thing to know. Where is the cannabis product being produced is important. So for instance, if it's being produced within Canada for a study running within Canada, that would be much easier to accomplish than a production outside of Canada needing to be imported. But you have to consider all of those things. The site that's performing the clinical trial within Canada does need to have applicable licenses to run that work. So within a clinical setting, you need a research license, which is contingent on obviously having all of the security standards in place that would be mandated by the cannabis legislation, the Cannabis Act. And you also need potentially other licenses as well. At minimum, you would need that research license. In Montreal, at our CRO in Montreal, we also have what's called a cannabis drug license, which allows us to perform transactions. So imagine that we had multiple sites within Canada where we needed to distribute or move the cannabis product around or the drug around. We would be legally allowed to perform those transactions with that license. It's not a requirement for a CRO as a site to have that license, but it is something that we have. And our bioanalysis facility also needs to have their own separate analytical license in order to work with cannabis products as reference standard, or doing the analysis for, let's say, PK samples. They need an analytical license to perform that work. These are licenses that you need to apply for through the Cannabis Licensing Division within Canada. Traditionally, that would have gone through the narcotics division, or similarly the DEA in the US, but that's changed since all of the legislation has changed. So those are really important. You cannot start the study without those. You may or may not still need to apply for a clinical trial application. So again, just because something is legal doesn't mean that you don't need a CTA application within Canada to run a drug study. Anything that's intended for a claim or a health claim would require a clinical trial application. So you would not be able to proceed without that as well. If we're looking at the US, the processes are quite different there. It also does depend on what you're looking at in terms of scheduling and what the product is. Within the US, marijuana is still considered a Schedule I substance, which is the highest, let's say, control over a DEA classification that you can have. As Beatrice mentioned, there is one product, Epidiolex, that has been approved for therapeutic use, and it's recently been descheduled, but that actually does not allow you, let's say, as a cannabidiol producer, to just assume that your product will also be descheduled. At the moment, unless you have a purely synthetic cannabidiol, you are still required to file an IND and also have a DEA Schedule 1 license to perform that study or your group of studies. And then until your product is actually approved and ready for scheduling, that's when the agency will tell you whether you're descheduled or not. So it takes, I'd say, a lot of knowledge about the individual product and the area where you're intending to run the study to ensure that you're actually doing this all within the legal framework.
And how about manufacturing? Are there regulatory conditions on that side?
Yeah, there are. So for the recreational market, there are some pretty strict manufacturing regulations within Canada. Most manufacturing of cannabis needs to adhere to what's called GPP, Good Production Practices. This is not as strict as traditional GMP for drug development. So if you were talking about the recreational market, the edibles, let's say, market, and anything intended for consumers, that goes under GPP. It doesn't require as much analytical, information behind the CMC. But the minute you're intending to put this into humans for therapy or medicinal, let's say, it now needs to follow traditional GMPs. And, you would have to treat those products exactly the same way that you would treat a traditional drug.
And how long does it take to start studies with cannabis in Canada?
So it again depends on the scope of the trial and also what your intended number of sites would be. A very simple study can take, less than, let's say, 45 to 60 days to start up. This is really also looking at sites that already have an institutional research license, in which case you really only need then to file your clinical trial application, which is no different than any other study that we would run at Altasciences in Montreal. If you were, sponsor was looking to start up multiple hospital sites or across Canada or across the US even, it's going to take a lot longer because each one of those sites is going to need to have a research license applied for. The target delivery for those licenses right now is 42 working days from Health Canada, and that's the Cannabis office. So in addition to your clinical trial application, you're going to need to have that license in place. That doesn't take into account any import that you might need to do with products coming from outside of the area. And that can usually be handled in parallel, but still you need some approvals before you can get that step done. If you're talking about the US, it also depends on, again, the nature of the drug and the study. A Schedule 1 license in the US can take anywhere between 30 days and an unlimited amount of time. That's difficult to predict depending on the state you're in and depending on the current scheduling requirements within that state. And also the backlog that they have. But you need to target at least 30 days for that Schedule 1 review. And then most likely an IND that is either already open or needs to be open to start off that program of work. And if it's not a drug study, then at minimum you need the ethics review at both sites as well.
Okay. And to conclude for our interview today, regulatory requirements for cannabinoid research is always evolving. So what advice would you have for our listeners today? Let's start with Beatrice.
Well, the regulators are always concerned about safety and efficacy in establishing a product for general use or for a targeted therapeutic indication. But you also have to really, with cannabis, depending on what type of product you're presenting, really also evaluate the abuse potential and how to mitigate not only unintended use or overdose, but exposure to children And having risk mitigation for your product is very important as well, so that it doesn't fall into a child's hand. And sometimes the formulations that you choose to manufacture your product in can make it more have a higher abuse potential or a lower abuse potential depending on the product. So for example, there has been a lot of concern with edibles looking very appealing to a younger market, in children potentially. So understanding not only what your product is and how it's intended, but also how it's going to be packaged and how it's going to be safely kept and stored in the homes of the targeted recipients and end users. So there's a lot to consider also from that perspective. And when you're applying for any kind of product, irrespective of the pathway, you need to be able to think through carefully and have a detailed plan outlining how you're going to mitigate those risks in both the clinical trial setting during your development program, as well as once it becomes marketed. So that is a very important consideration for throughout the program, and that is something that the developers will be looking for in terms of the benefits and the risk-benefit profile of any product that's under review.
And Ingrid?
Yeah, I think Beatrice summarized that really nicely. I think the only thing I'd add to that is two things, really. You do have to find, if you don't have it in-house already, people that do keep on top of the regulations and what they are in the area that they work, and also the area that you're intending to market your product. So this is where, you know, a CRO like ours is important. This is a niche of ours. It's our responsibility to actually stay current on, you know, what those regulations are and help guide our clients for the best strategy that we see across our own networks. And we also benefit from, of course, having 40 to 50 of these trials in our past. And we see lots of different examples of what clients are working towards, and we can apply that knowledge as we gather it ourselves to the next discussion that we're having. So a CRO selection is very important. Also, really just getting the regulatory feedback early on is very, very important as well. Yeah, the rules are changing and people are bringing up new twists and new important points all the time. And it's not always easy to get in touch with the regulation or the body, the regulatory body that you're intending to submit to. So you might actually need some help with that from either a regulatory consultant, or really just working directly with that agency. Make sure that you understand the full scope of what they're going to expect from you before you dive in, because otherwise you're not going to have necessarily the right plan from the beginning, and you could get out of scope very, very quickly.
That's great.
And to follow on Ingrid's point about selecting the right CRO, you certainly want to have a CRO that's experienced with the products, is able to medically manage the effects of THC and these types of products from a safety perspective, have the ability to recruit the appropriate population, including the recreational THC users in particular, a pharmacy that's well-equipped and versatile and able to handle various different formulation routes of administration, different devices that these products come with. We've done at Altasciences, we've handled everything from different types of volcano administrator devices to smoked vaping devices and just combustibles. So you do need to have experienced staff that are able to prepare the type of product that's being administered in the clinic. And as I mentioned earlier, controlled smoking areas that enable you to safely administer these. So it really requires a very broad team that has expertise in handling these types of formulations, these types of products, so that they're safely administered in a consistent way, that you don't have malfunctions and that you have backups and have a good understanding and experience of how to administer these different types of, particularly when it's mixed with combined with a device that needs to be well managed, and the instructions need to be very clearly given to the subjects or patients participating in the trial so that they can use it in a correct fashion. And that's also very important in these trials. So this is something that needs to be very carefully vetted, and fortunately, we've, as Ingrid mentioned, we've had extensive experience with these types of studies. It's one of our areas of expertise and specialties, so it's something that a lot of our clients come to us for advice on how to not only get through the regulatory hurdles in starting up the clinical trials, but also how to conduct these in the most robust, the safest, and the studies with the most data integrity that will meet the regulatory requirements based on their development needs.
Thank you very much. This concludes our interview for today. So I'd like to thank you, Beatrice, thank you, Ingrid, for your time, and thank you for our listeners. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye-bye.